You may not consider slavery a hot topic, but it's been coming up quite a bit lately. And one of the contexts in which it comes up is folks saying, I'm not going to believe that Bible. The Bible says that slavery is a good thing. And because they say slavery is, the Bible says that slavery is good, that they have a way to talk people out of believing in what the scriptures say, believing that the Bible is a legitimate document from God. So I thought we would just discuss that some tonight. So if you ever hear that, if anybody ever says that in your presence, or you see this discussion on the media or whatever, you'll have something to add to it. I started with a historical preface. I thought it was interesting that 3 of our first presidents are documented as quoting themselves or making hard statements against slavery. George Washington, first president, said, "I can only say that there's not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." And then Thomas Jefferson. And by the way, be advised that some of these guys owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson had some slaves. But he said this: "The abolition of domestic slavery is the greatest object of desire in these colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state." That's Thomas Jefferson, 3rd President of the United States. And then James Monroe said, "We have found that this evil, slavery, has preyed upon the very vitals of the Union and has been prejudicial to all the states in which it has existed." That's James Monroe, 5th President. I don't know exactly what all these guys thought, but if slavery was the norm and you knew that you could bring slaves onto your property and treat them well, maybe that's what some of these guys had in mind who were against slavery and yet had slaves. I didn't think I'd forget his name. Give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry. Also had slaves on his plantation. Well, plantation, on his property. But these were men who, in the long run, put down in the document that is the Declaration, not the Declaration, the Constitution, that all humans have rights. And that's what eventually brought this nation to conclude that this practice needed to be abolished as it was practiced in the first century of our nation's existence. Now, look at B, about halfway down the page. The challenge for 21st century Americans is to study the slavery of biblical times without judging it by the worst examples of slavery in early America. They're not the same thing. Slavery in the Bible is not the same thing as what was practiced here in our first century of existence as a nation. And then C, we need to consider the historical context of biblical slavery. We have it good today. We've got all kinds of welfare programs. If something happens and you lose your job, you've got resources like unemployment insurance. There are places where you can go to get food, people who will help you with housing benefits. There are all kinds of opportunities for help if you are out of work or incapacitated. They didn't have those when God gave the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. Where were they at Mount Sinai? They were in the middle of the desert. They'd all been slaves. The whole nation had been enslaved. And now they're all out in the desert, and God gives them the law, and slavery was part of that law. Let's see how that slavery worked. These are God's stipulations for slavery. Oh, by the way, I didn't want to overlook Luke 15, the story about the young man who demanded from his father his inheritance before he was supposed to get it, went off and lived foolishly, wasted all of his money. Where did he find himself? He was a slave feeding hogs, and he wanted to eat what the hogs were eating. That's how bad off his situation was. What did he say to himself? I'm going to go back, and I'm going to ask my father if he'll let me be one of his slaves, one of his servants. at least serving under my father, I will have a place to eat, I'll have food. And that's what he went back to gain, because he knew that would be a better situation than what he was in feeding those hogs. So we've got an example of it right there in the teachings of Jesus, of slavery being something that people would depend on when they really got down and out. And here are God's stipulations. Exodus 21. Go ahead and flip back there. 1 through 6 teaches that Israelites could be purchased as slaves. These are the ordinances which you are to set before them. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he's the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man, then his master shall bring him to God, then he shall bring him to the door of the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. So how long is he supposed to serve? 6 years, and he goes out free on the 7th year. If he came as a single man and he takes a wife of his own volition, then that wife remains his wife, and when he goes out on the 7th year, he takes his wife with him. But if his master provides him a wife, and it stipulates here if she has children, but I believe the same would apply if they don't have any children, that she remains property of the master. That doesn't mean they're no longer married. It just means when he leaves the household, he's not under the master's care or supervision anymore, that she remains under his supervision. That was the way that worked. A slave may choose to remain with his master. How many of you have heard or even sung the song, Pierce My Ear? It's been considered a kind of a devotional song, but this is the background of that song, where a slave would come to the master and say, I don't want to leave. I want to stay with you. I've got it good here. And the master would take that slave to the door, take an awl, a sharp steel tool, and pierce his ear. And that hole in his ear would represent his own choice to stay with his master. So anytime you saw a servant and he had that hole in his ear, and I don't know, he probably put something in there to keep it open. You know, you girls all know about that stuff. Well, some guys do too now. So that's what would happen. The situation was such that it wasn't set up to be adversarial. This was supposed to be beneficial to people who didn't have any means of support. You couldn't go to the welfare office. You couldn't go to unemployment. You couldn't get disability insurance. So if you were down and out, you could go to somebody who had financial resources or physical resources, and you could say, I will sell myself to you. And the guy says, okay, I'll bring you on. I'll put you to work. You'll work for me for 6 years, and at the end of 6 years, you'll be released, but at least you'll have a place where you can live and be safe. Because it wasn't just about having a place to live where you could have a roof over your head and something in your belly. If you were alone, you were subject to all kinds of abuse. Now, I know that we're talking about them being out in the desert, but if you don't even have a place to stay, if you're living on the street, do you remember when God, well, actually the two angels went down to Sodom, and Lot met these guys at the gate. And Lot said to them, come and stay with me in my house. What did the angels say? We'll stay out here on the street. He said, no, you don't want to stay out here on the street. You need to be indoors where there's safety and security. And so he took them to his house. And sure enough, even inside, the people of the city came and banged on the door and said, bring those guys out. So there was security if you were a slave. You were part of a household. That's the way it was supposed to work. Verses 7 through 11. If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she's not to go free as male slaves do. If she's displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. if he does not have authority to sell her, or he does not have authority to sell her to a foreign people because of his unfairness to her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. If he takes to himself another woman, marries another woman, he may not reduce her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he will not do these three things for her, then she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. So at the bottom of the outline, this is under the last section there, 2:7 to 11. A man may sell his daughter into slavery. So you've got a family and you're destitute. Something happens and your money is gone. You have no means of supporting yourself or supporting your family. You take your daughter to somebody who can provide a living for her, and you sell her to that individual, and that guy says, yes, I'll take her into my home. She'll be my servant. He might even make her a wife. He might make her a wife for his son. At any rate, she comes into that household, and now she has a place of security. She has somebody to take care of her, put a roof over her head, put food in her mouth. And now you, as the father, you can try to find a way to regain your status, your resources, get a job, whatever you might be able to do, and even redeem your daughter. But that's what this is all about. And he cannot sell her, the master cannot sell her to folks who are not Israelites. Second page. Everybody got a second page where it says at the top E, little e? All right. If he takes another wife for himself, he can't diminish the provisions for the first wife, either materially or conjugally. Her food, her clothing, everything that she's supposed to have as his wife, she's supposed to continue to get. If he doesn't want to provide her with these things, he's tired of her, he doesn't like her, then she does not have to pay to be set free. He has to set her free, and she does not have to pay for that freedom. Verse 16, it doesn't directly address slavery, but what it says is, he who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. In other words, the law says we're not going to have any human trafficking. You don't kidnap people. You don't keep them for yourself. You don't kidnap them and sell them to somebody else. That's human trafficking. It's not exactly the same thing we're looking at today, because almost all of that today has to do with sex trafficking. But this is just having to do with slavery. Number 4, verses 20 to 21. Killing a slave was to result in punishment. You look back up in 21:12, it says, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. And then you look at verse 20. If he strikes his male or female slave with a rod and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished. It's interesting, verse 21 though, says, but if he lives a day or two, it'll be all right. Man, these were hard times. That's a tough situation. But this was still a means to care for people, or for people to be cared for who did not have the means to care for themselves. Verses 26 to 27 come back to interactions with slaves. It says, injuring a slave's eye or knocking out a tooth was to result in the slave's freedom. So, if you're going to be harsh with your slave, you're not supposed to be harsh in the first place. We'll read that also. But if you are harsh and you knock out an eye, man, you've just lost your slave. You knock out a tooth, you've lost your slave. They get their freedom if you injure them in that way. And probably, I really doubt that it was just an eye or just a tooth. I would imagine that those who judged the law would have said that any injury that's a significant injury would cause that master to lose that slave. Now, that's just speculation on my part. I should have looked into the Mishnah about that, except I'm sure there would have been about 30 pages of detailed information. Yes? Okay? Code of Hammurabi was? Okay. One of the differences they noticed between God's law and the Code of Hammurabi was I don't know if you've ever heard of the Code of Hammurabi, but you can Google that. Don't Google it right now, but Google it when you get home tonight and take a look at that. In God's law, if you stole, what was the punishment? No, that's Islam. You had to make restitution. If you stole, they caught you, now you make restitution. And if you can't make restitution, then you were sold into slavery. You became a slave of the guy from whom you stole. So, but in the Code of Hammurabi, there were much harsher penalties. In some cases, death, even for things like stealing. You don't see that in God's law. It's very distinct when you go to what God's law says about such things from the laws of the land around there at the time. Carolyn? Hammurabi, he invented ham, so he couldn't be Jewish. No, he was Babylonian. He was an ancient ruler. I don't even know if they called him a king, but he was a very influential fella, and they had writing. He wrote this code down. They found, I don't know if I can't remember if they found the entire code, but they found at least a portion of it. Okay. It's interesting, so Google it and look up the Code of Hammurabi and see what Google has to say about it. What's that? You betcha. I was watching Archie Bunker the other night, and a friend of his died, a guy that he worked with for like 12 years, and the guy turned out to be Jewish, and he didn't know he was Jewish. And he said, well, his name was Stretch Cunningham. I didn't think a Jew would have ham in his name. But more from the law on slavery is from Leviticus chapter 25, verses 35 to 38. If a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor he has to sell part of his property. I'm sorry, I'm picking up at the wrong spot. 35. That's property. That's not people, that's property in verse 25. But 35 is people. Leviticus chapter 25, 35. In the case of a countryman of yours becomes poor and his means with regard to you falter, then you are to sustain him like a stranger or a sojourner that he may live with you. Do not take usurious interest from him, but revere your God, so that your countrymen may live with you. You shall not give him your silver at interest, nor your food for gain. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. Anything strike you when you read this? Yes. Yes. Why would God say, you shall revere me, when he gives this teaching? What's that like saying? What does that sound like to you? Okay. Why would your mama say that? Okay. When God says, here's what I want you to do, revere me, it sounds to me like, and this is just my personal speculation, God understood there would have been great temptation on the part of the people he was talking to not to do what he said. And so he said, you better listen to me. I'm God. You better revere me. And he says that in verse 36. And then he says in verse 38, this is what James was talking about, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land and be your God. So I'm the one who did that for you. You better revere me. You better not abuse your brother. When your brother falls on hard times, Don't you mistreat and abuse your brother. How do folks typically feel about poor people? We avoid them. Proverbs even says that. Why do we avoid poor people? Okay, he probably deserves to be poor. He could do better. What else? What? Okay, if you give them money, then you won't have any money. It's like, what do you have when you feed the birds? Fat birds. Who wants fat birds? It's not a good result when you do that. Anything else? Okay. What is the mistrust about? Okay. If I help this guy now, today, what's going to happen tomorrow? He's going to come back. Just like when you're looking out the back door and there's a stray cat in your yard, you can feed that cat. But if you feed that cat, it's now your cat because it's going to be back. So just, if you want a cat, that's a good way to get one. Just sit at your back door until a stray goes through and feed it. Typically, we don't really care much for poor people because we know poor people are going to cost us something. God is telling his people in the law, you're going to have poor people. What did Jesus say? The poor you're going to have with you all the time. He didn't say the poor you're going to have with you until you figure out a good government program to take care of all of them. You can't have a good enough government program that's going to take care of everybody because some people want to be downtown under the bridge. I'm not saying everybody does, but they know, they've done studies, they've tried to pull these guys in, they've built shelters, they've spent thousands and millions of dollars to provide places and food, and a lot of those guys are out under the bridge because that's where they want to be. He's an entrepreneur. That's the way it happens a lot of times. We don't know when that's going to happen and who that's going to happen with. And so God says, here's the provision in the law. When you got a brother that needs help, help him. And don't take advantage of him when you help him. But beyond that, look at verse 39. If a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave's service. Remember, he's talking about a countryman, a fellow Israelite. He shall be with you as a hired man, as if he were a sojourner. He shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. What in the world is the year of Jubilee? Well, we passed up on that. That's in the first part of chapter 25. The year of Jubilee was when you would count 7 years of Sabbath. How many years would that be? 49. So on every 50th year was a Jubilee year, and you let all your slaves go. It didn't matter if they've been with you for the regular 6 years that they were supposed to work, or just 6 months. When that Jubilee year came, you turned your slaves loose. And when that Jubilee year came, if anybody owed you money, guess what? They didn't owe you money anymore. It was a year of release. And it was a continual reminder to the Israelites that they had been released. Yes? Well, I don't know if anybody's kept records. It would be a good time, I would think, but I was thinking Sunday morning, when I came in, there were already pictures posted at 7 o'clock Sunday morning of the saints having met in India for the Lord's Day, because that's on the other side of the world. It was Sunday over there before it was Sunday here, and Jubilee years, it's going to be hitting the Jubilee year one day, and it won't be hitting the Jubilee year on the other side of the earth until the day goes all. Anyway, who knows? I think the best time for the Lord to come back is when we're taking the Lord's Supper. Except only one part of the world can be doing that because everybody else is in a different time frame. Will.
A more solid group, if you want to put it that way.
I don't know of any specific instance in Scripture, but I'm sure it would work out that way. Just think of it in terms of you're 20 years old, and you don't have a skill. You don't know how to do anything, except maybe dig a ditch or something like that. And so you say to this guy who's got land and property, I'll become one of your servants, and I'll work for you. And the guy says, great. See those guys over there working the goats? You go over there, and they'll show you how to work goats. And so you go over there, and for the first year, you work goats. And then after a while, hey, you're a pretty good goat herder. We need a guy helping over here with the camels. And so you go over there, and you start working with the camels. Anybody here know how to, besides DW, I know DW knows how to work stock, and Frank knows how to work some stock. We got probably some other guys here and there know how to work stock. Okay, I don't know the first thing about working stock. Well, Owen is raising pigs. I don't know how to raise a pig. I know how to eat a pig. You give me one, I can cut him up and make chops, but I don't know how to raise a pig. If he gets sick, I don't know what to do. But somebody else says, hey, we need help out in the fields. Get this guy out here, and we'll show him how to plant some squash, show him how to plant hay, show him how to plant whatever. And next thing you know, he's skinning a cow and making leather with the hide. And what you do is you learn how to work. You learn a trade. You learn skills that you wouldn't have learned if you didn't have some place to work. And after doing that, you get to know all those people. You trust them. They trust you. You got a roof over your head. You got food in your belly. You've got security. You don't have dreams of going to college. You've got dreams of being safe and well fed. And it's fulfilled here. You've signed on as a slave, and man, next year is the 7th year. I don't know if I want to go out. I got it pretty good here. I think I'll go to my master and see if he'll let me stay. Can you see how this would work? And it's not about, okay, fill up some storerooms with money, and when somebody's poor, just hand them some money. That's not the way this works. Somebody's poor, okay, put them to work. Feed them. Put them to work. Give them a place to sleep. Put them to work. Make sure they're safe with all the other hired hands that you've got and slaves that you've got. That's the way it worked. Yes. This was a great plan. Everybody benefited from this. The master benefited, he got some work. The slave benefited. He got security and something to eat, skills he would learn. Everybody benefited from this, and nothing is going to work perfectly because people are people. But this is about the best plan you could come up with. How far along in this have we gotten here? Where are we? 39 to 43. He's got to be treated like a hired man. If an Israelite sells himself to somebody else, he's going to serve until the year of Jubilee and be released. He's never to be sold, and he's never to be ruled over with severity. So here's where the law says, if you've got slaves, don't you mistreat them. Don't you take advantage of them. Do not rule over them with severity. And then verses 44 to 46. As for you male and female slaves whom you have, you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. Then too, it is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition, and out of their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land. They also may become your possession. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves. But in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. What was the original plan for the inhabitants of Canaan when Israel came in? Wipe them out, kill them all. Why was that? You go back to Genesis 15, God tells Abraham, I'm not bringing your people into this country for another 400 years. Why? Because the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet full. And then when God gave Israel the law, he said, here's all the things, the horrible sins I don't want you to do, because this is what the people who've lived in Canaan have done, and the land has spewed them out. So now we've got a situation where not all those people have been killed. Some of them are still around. God says, you can acquire slaves. You can't kidnap them in the middle of the night. The law says you can't do that. But you can acquire slaves from them. Now, in the long term, what's the real benefit to pagans who become slaves of Israelites? Would they have to wait 10 generations? But what would you learn about? You would learn about God. You would learn, oh, there's a God that's different from the ones I've been worshiping. And in the process of living with Jews, you would learn about the true and living God, and that would be could potentially be your salvation. So there's another benefit to this. Verses 47 to 55. If the means of a stranger or of a sojourner with you becomes sufficient, and a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to him as to sell himself to a stranger who is sojourning with you, or to the descendants of a stranger's family, then he shall have redemption right after he has been sold. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his uncle's son may redeem him, or one of his blood relatives from his family may redeem him, or if he prospers, he may redeem himself. What's this saying? You got strangers living among you. They're not Israelites, but they're doing well, they're prospering. And you've got an Israelite who falls on hard times, and he says, well, here's a guy, he's not an Israelite, but he's a good guy. I'll sell myself to him. And so he makes the purchase, brings this Israelite on board. Now, what right does that Israelite have from day one? He's got the right to be bought back out of slavery, to be redeemed. So you can serve somebody who's not an Israelite. You can even be their slave, and that's all right. Now you look at the law, you're not supposed to have any dealings with Gentiles. But God says, under these conditions, you can have dealings with Gentiles. You can be the slave or a servant of a non-Jewish person. But you always have the right of redemption. Even if he's not redeemed, and even though he's belonging to somebody who's not an Israelite, who will go free in the year of Jubilee. That's another stipulation. All right, from Deuteronomy 15. I think we're going to get through this. Yes? Oh, okay. Yes. My understanding is that if you lived among the Jews, that's what this is about. If you've got an alien, what's an alien? Well, he's somebody who doesn't belong there. But that's where he is. So if he's staying with you, he's got to live by your rules. These are the laws that he has to live under. In other words, well, I don't remember how much we talked about this, but what are a lot of Muslims demanding when they come to America? Sharia law. And what should we be telling them? Go home. You live under our law, or you go home. And that's what God was saying here. This is our law. If you're an alien, you're a stranger, you're a sojourner living among us, you live under our law. That's just the way it works. No excuses, no apologies. This is our land. God gave it to us. This is our law. You live among us. You live according to our laws. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. So go to Italy and get drunk, because that's what the Romans do. I don't think that's what that means, but I don't think so. Deuteronomy 15, starting at verse 12. If your kinsman, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you, then he shall serve you 6 years, but in the 7th year you shall set him free. We've already read that, but he's bringing it up again. But he adds this in verse 13. When you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your sacrifices, and from your threshing floor, and from your wine vat. You shall give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you. This just gets better and better. You go to work for some guy, you're going to work for him for 6 years, but when the 6 years is up, if you want to leave, he's obligated now to send you out with a grub stake. You've worked for 6 years, you've bound to have learned some kind of a skill, some kind of an ability. If you want, you can even go be somebody else's servant. Maybe in the course of you working his stuff, you've seen other guys who've come in and done business with him, and you think, well, I'd rather work for that guy. So you go out after 6 years, and you go to that other guy and say, hey, how about if I sell myself to you? He says, well, okay, great, come on board. And you come on board now with a grub stake. You've been given out of the threshing floor, out of the wine vat, out of the flock. You've got something to work with. You've got some resources. This is the way you keep your dignity and your self-respect, and you provide for a family. But what's at the bottom of it? You work. You work. You don't sit at home, wait for a check to arrive. You work. It's called slavery. But it's not what happened here prior to the Civil War. Where are we here? You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. This is 15:15. And the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this today. It shall come about, if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he fares well with you, then you shall take an awl and pierce it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your servant forever. Also you shall do likewise to your maidservant. There it is again. Same idea. Last page. Yeah. God says, verse 18, it shall not seem hard to you when you set him free. For he's given you 6 years with double the service of a hired man, so the Lord your God will bless you in whatever you do. So God is saying to the masters, when that 7th year comes and you turn these guys loose, you be generous to them, and if you're generous with them, sending out this guy who's slave for you for 6 years, I will be generous to you. That's God's promise. And so as a master, you could say, yeah, it's a pretty good deal. I'm going to pull this guy in. I'm going to get a lot of good labor from him. I'm not going to have to pay him a whole lot. I'm going to have to pay him when the 6 years is up. But after 6 years, he's going to be a productive citizen. I will have trained him. He will have learned skills. If I'm good to him, he might stay with me, and everything would be even better than it was before. So there's all kinds of blessings to this. Conclusion. Yes, if you were destitute, illiterate, unskilled, and defenseless against those who would abuse you, slavery was a good option. You'd be fed, housed, likely trained in some means of making a living, and also protected for a time and then released with a grub stake to start your life as a free man. This was God's plan. God's plans are always pretty good plans. Any questions, any comments? I hope now you feel like you can make some defense of the Bible when somebody says, oh, the Bible says slavery is good, so the Bible can't be any good. Bill? Slaves, yeah. Right. And if you think about it, if you took these principles, and there were plenty of folks who did, even in the South, there were slave owners. When Emancipation Proclamation came, the slaves said, we don't want to go somewhere else. You're treating us good. We've got a good place here. We've got family here. We know this land. We know how to work it. We know the animals. If you're treating us right, we don't want to leave. Freedom is one thing, but having a life is another. And if we keep thinking like 21st century Americans, yeah, well, I want my freedom. I want to go to college and get a good job and buy me a couple of cars and have a retirement plan. That wasn't the way people thought. When you just want to have the next meal and some security in life. So I think that's the second or third bell. Dayton? Yes. Mm-hmm. And that's right. That's what was being applied from here. Well, all right. We got to quit. I hope you've enjoyed tonight. I have. Who came in?